Good morning and welcome. This is the Feather of a Light podcast. This morning I'd like to bring in the topic that I feel controls so much of our lives, whether we're conscious of it or not. And that's the topic of this emotion of anger. Ooh, anger. Or even just bringing up the word, maybe it's kind of like, maybe you feel some kind of activation in your body. Maybe you don't. Maybe you're just kind of thinking of the last time you experienced someone else's anger, or maybe something comes up around an angry person that you've seen on television, right? This portrayal of anger. And those things are all fine and well, and they're part of your experience of this emotion we call anger. However, I would like to explore this topic a little bit more in depth, getting curious about what anger is from the perspective of Brene Brown, and just speaking to my personal experience of how I've began to feel into my experience of anger, which initially wasn't, I would say, all that pronounced, I suppose. So just to start off, I believe when I was little, I was, pretty angry at times. Maybe not overly angry all the time, but I think I felt anger, right? I think most infants do once they hit a certain point. And then once you get a little bit older, maybe pre-teenhood, there's that angst that I would say is an expression of anger, sort of spun in a different way, I suppose. And and I think I did hold on to a lot of anger and resentment towards my dad, towards society. I suppose I wouldn't say anger necessarily, but I think I held on to a lot of bitterness towards women because I wasn't exactly received. You know what? Not by all women. That's actually so untrue to say that I wasn't received by women. I feel as though I had a couple interactions when I was probably like 14 or 16, probably one in each of those years, where I just wasn't received. And, probably there was very valid reasons why, right? Like thinking back to my adolescent self. But yeah, how those created this type of bitterness towards women that I would say lasted for maybe the better part of my teen years and into my early 20s before I started to bottle it all up. And I would say with the self-awareness that came that I don't want people to experience my anger. I don't want to be perceived as an angry person. I don't want to view myself as an angry person, which I think is something that, for me at least, was a part of starting to be self-responsible for my impact on others. Maybe there was a degree of this was becoming like a new form of my people-pleasing. But yeah, I would say that I basically just decided anger wasn't something that I felt had a function, and I didn't really want to feel angry. And it just was easier not to feel angry too, I suppose. Avoiding confrontations, staying small, making more friends, right? Making more friends. Maybe just acquaintances, but just being more sociable and happy within those dynamics and not setting boundaries where I maybe needed to, or, probably didn't lean into confrontations when I should have. And I'm speaking more too when I started to get older and started to have, like, I would say, healthier friendships. But then, after years of bottling up my anger, which I think it was probably at least 5 years, and by the way, bottling up my anger doesn't mean I didn't feel anger. Just means I didn't express it in an attempt to sort of preserve my relationships, or even just the perceptions of me in my relationships, perceptions of me from other. And yeah, just trying to really uphold this title or this role or this identity of the masculine that is an angry or non-aggressive, more approachable. I don't even want to say the nice guy. I don't like that word, but maybe I was trying to be something of a nice guy, but I didn't take it to the extreme, I'd suppose. I didn't identify with that, but I just felt there was enough aggression. I think that started actually with viewing my dad as an sort of aggressive person, maybe more passive aggressive, maybe, actually, yeah, he was a passive aggressive person. I think he still in many ways is, but I think he was a lot worse when he was younger and he was raising us. So then I viewed this aggression as an unhealthy form of anger. And then he also did blow up on us a few times when we were teens and when we were younger a little bit, but I think he hid his anger really well. Like, I think he was the type of male where he understood that if he was angry all the time, that was a problem. And I applaud his self-awareness on that part, but I also do feel like he didn't really work with that anger and he bottled it up, and he essentially, and still I would say does, do what I did for many years and now have over these last couple of years attempted to move away from, right? I don't want to people please. I don't want to be passive aggressive. I don't want to have unresolved conflicts. I don't want to feel all this tension in my body and allow it to manifest as, I would say, mental illness or physical illness, chronic pain, muscle pain, maybe even just mental blocks. So that's a little overview of my experience of anger. It started off when I was young, decided I should bottle it up probably at a certain point when I was younger, when I just decided I don't want to be perceived as the angry kid. And then that became sort of this version of people pleasing. I don't want to be perceived as the angry teen. And then at a certain point where I did this whole spiritual journey, it kind of started to become, so I suppose I'm the spiritually balanced male who doesn't feel angry because I can, in a way, feel into that sort of calmness and balance. And, I would say it was a form of spiritual bypass, really. I was able to really happily bypass any desire to explore my anger because I could look to, the Zen philosophies or monks and all these different personas and spiritual teachings that are kind of like, be still, be this calm, open container for quietness. And, I was obviously onto something when I started to explore those ideas, but I feel like spiritual bypass ends when you meditate for sake of avoiding your emotions. I learned this in the book, Singing to the Plants. I mean, I'm sure that same lesson is echoed throughout a lot of different teachings, but that's where I came across it. They define spiritual bypass, using that example, that if you meditate for sake of pushing away your feelings, that is how you are engaging in a spiritual bypass. You're bypassing the human experience through a spiritual practice. And I felt like I've done that for an incredibly long time and still on some level do. But now I would say, a lot more aware of when I'm starting to engage in that practice, even if I am spending some time trying to meditate or do yoga to regulate my emotions and remove myself from an emotional experience, I feel like doing that can also be an indicator, and often is an indicator, that I need to dedicate a space to really deepen into the experience of that emotion, and will dedicate that space to do so. So, or something that alchemizes the feelings, allows me to feel and move through the feeling versus further disassociate myself from the experience of anger. So maybe just getting back to the topic more generally, what is anger? How can we define this thing, this emotion? And I mean, it's a little bit challenging to define emotion sometimes, but let's just say from the neuroscientific standpoint, the neuroscience of it, there's this thing called the amygdala. Right? It's the emotion center within the brain. It looks like an almond. It's about in the dead center of certain brain networks, which the name is eluding me. I spent some time studying neuroscience, but of course, it's been years now. But limbic system. Yeah, the limbic system. So there's this network called the limbic system that's an inner layer of the brain. And within its approximately the dead center, there's the amygdala, and it's what's responsible for your emotional experience. And your amygdala is one of these brain systems that's basically based in survival. It's really rooted, and its primary function is to keep us safe. It's a survival-based brain system. And the limbic system, I believe it also is connected to, and I believe it also does incorporate the reptilian brain, so the brain stem, which is basically where you see, I believe it's actually where the vagus nerve is connected to, but the brain stem is what tells the rest of the body it needs to engage in the fight or flight response. So the amygdala connects with the brain stem, and that tells the whole, nervous system to engage or disengage. And so there's just that direct connection between these networks. And often what'll happen is our muscles and nervous system and everything that senses information, it receives signals, and that goes up through the brainstem, and that interacts with the amygdala, and the amygdala will then go on to activate certain hormones, or it'll go on to activate other brain networks, and eventually it'll get to the prefrontal cortex, where you kind of like make decisions, right? There's higher thinking around the emotion. So it's kind of like you have your initial emotional experience that's just based in this, basically, sum of the sensory data, right? Whatever you've acquired externally, you start to form an emotion based on that. And then once the amygdala has appraised what this emotion is, or what it feels like, or why it feels this emotion might be coming in, it goes on to activate other brain systems. And then there's a secondary appraisal. So it returns back to the prefrontal cortex. So there's kind of like this loop, or this, relay between these two networks. And yeah, your secondary appraisal of emotion can actually be very extreme, and it can actually cause a even more intense reaction depending on how you appraise that emotion. So yeah, I think that's a really interesting way to look at emotions, and that's how we're taught in school, and that's how some people understand it if they study counseling, or if they've been to a counselor who teaches about this stuff, is that you start off with the initial emotion, and then depending on how you interpret that emotion, that'll actually cause a secondary emotion, and that emotion can be very different from the initial emotion. And it can be activating different parts of the body too. So, the first emotion might activate certain sensations within the body, but then the secondary appraisal might actually draw from previous experience, right? Because it's getting more of the prefrontal cortex, and it's getting more of your long-term memory involved in the process of feeling that emotion. So this can be a good thing or this can be a negative thing if, your interpretation says that, oh, this is something we really don't like. This is something we really ought to be careful around. And that can activate other muscle groups and create additional fear, additional anxiety, right? And this is where I feel like there's this parallel with looking at how these brain systems interact and parts work, is because you are communicating with these parts and you're trying to actually consciously communicate with the way these neural nets operate. So I was listening to a video on parts work, watching the video and listening to the information, and I loved how they basically just said that parts are essentially neural nets. And I feel like if you look to how these systems operate, this loop between the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex and the brainstem, it's essentially like the way that you decide to bring awareness to those neural nets as parts is how you're creating a dialogue with your own mind. You're actually introducing conscious awareness and conscious control to what is otherwise firing automatically. And I believe it's the medial prefrontal cortex. It's a part of the brain that basically comes in, and it's what's this person linked to self energy. It's kind of like the ability to witness the experience of an emotion is a part of the brain that you have to essentially engage. Like, you have to bring awareness to the emotional experience, and over time you start to get more used to that. So why do I bring in all this nerding out in this neuroscience and this parts work? Well, it's because you can bring awareness to your experience of anger, and it changes the experience of it entirely. It changes your capacity to sit with the anger. And it is very much a practice. It's very much something that you can over time learn to not feel so overwhelmed by, something that you can actually tap into and feel the wisdom of. And I would say you can also create space within the body and feel safer within that experience of the body, versus feeling like when you feel something in your body from the experience of anger, that triggers a secondary emotion of fear, and you don't know how to sit with that anger. And then the fear response is what's really directing you, and maybe on some level creating a more, just like chaotic experience of anger or aggressive experience of anger, is because there's a fear response linked to it. So Richard Schwartz mentions how when you're working with parts and IFS as a therapist, by the way, I don't know how much you could do this in your own experience, but it's probably possible. You don't want to jump right to grounding your nervous system. And this is actually very counter to how many people who are in therapy or how counselors approach someone who's dysregulated. So this is kind of this idea that you want to honor the experience of the protector part. And I'd say in the same way, you want to experience anger. You want to honor the experience of anger and not try to push it away. So Richard Schwartz, when he talks about protector parts, he says that we don't want to just jump to getting somebody into a breath work or a grounding technique, because in a way we're telling the protector part that it's not welcome, that it's not something that we want in the system, and we're pretty much just doing what we can to get rid of it. We're kind of tolerating the experience and then just pushing it out of the way in a way. So I see this parallel here with anger, and I would say because it's also linked to protector parts at times, but still, we don't necessarily need to just push it away. There's some wisdom here. There's something here that if we can sit with, it's very deeply valuable. And if the first intuition, so it's like we don't want to have one side of the polarity or other. If our first intuition is to act out in really aggressive and destructive ways, using the anger as a driving force for that, that's one, I would say, side of the polarity where it's too much. You're allowing it to have too much control over your nervous system and too much control over your secondary emotional experience. But if you're sort of, in a sense, not accepting the anger at all, and you're attempting to redirect the somatic experience of the anger, and you're attempting to regulate your nervous system before even attempting to understand the anger, there is a way to which You're telling the anger, or you're telling the part that's communicating through anger, that you're not welcome here. This is an experience that we're able to sit with. This is an experience that I'm willing to really listen to. And, if you look to the theory of parts work, that can really be quite disrespectful to the protector part that really is trying to do these things for a good reason. I would say we're feeling anger for a very good reason. Whether you look to the parts language or not, anger is being felt for a reason. There was a certain point in our past where the anger served a function, and not continuing that same narrative of I need to be angry so that I can feel safe, just being aware of what narrative or what story anger is telling you. What is your story of anger? Asking yourself, what was my story of anger when I was young, and how was it serving me then? But then just understanding that maybe it's not serving you in the same way now, and but still at the same time recognizing that bringing anger in and welcoming it and honoring it, there's a way to which you can have a relationship with anger that's healthy. There's a way to which you can, at times, alchemize it directly into something else. But I would even offer that before you go ahead and do that, is there a way you can sit with and listen to this anger? Is there something that it's trying to teach you? Is there some kind of boundary that it's trying to show you needs to be set? Is it trying to, in some way, bring attention to a situation where you feel the need to take action, or to advocate for yourself, or to advocate for another, right? Like, I think we see so much anger around social injustice because there's so much that we feel the need to take action on. And I feel like it's incredibly necessary for us all to stay informed and to feel these emotions and to take action in some shape or form. But I feel, and this is just my opinion of it, there's a lot of anger that just kind of is outward projections of a type of resentment that's built from not having the freedom or the autonomy to actually take action, to do something about that anger. And it just sort of builds and builds and builds, and it kind of just like festers, versus like, how can you take action? How can you really channel that anger into supporting people or advocating for people or using your voice? So just speaking to, my personal perspective on social justice, just a tiny, tiny bit, I do feel like it's normal to feel angry about social issues, and just looking for ways to which you can not allow that anger to take you over, not allow that anger to really fester and burrow within your body. And at the same time, recognizing that if there's a force for change, if there's something you can do, then you can utilize whatever resources you have. You can use your voice. You can find a way to create an offering. You can create those dialogues and not just hold on to that anger, right? You don't want to just internalize that anger, because then it becomes, it can become a passive aggression. It can start to impact your relationships. There's a variety of ways. There's a variety of ways to which anger can become problematic, as I've explained, if it's not understood, witnessed, alchemized. And kind of also to bring some awareness to how social media can be, I would say, a good catalyst for healthy anger, but it also can fuel just a continuous flow of anger that you don't necessarily know what to do with. So just like having the ability to set boundaries around social media, maybe that's even just how we feel angry about social media, is in a way telling us to set a boundary around something that's exposing us to so many things that are making us angry, right? It's like, turn off the TV if you're watching the news. Stay off your social media if you're continuously feeling triggered by what people are saying or what people are sharing. Give yourself some time off your phone and just destimulate. And maybe I would say it's likely you'll still feel angry about something, if you're attuned to your experience of anger and you're honoring that. But it's not going to be like a continuous firing to which you might not have control over. And then you can actually start to develop more of, I would say, an intimate relationship with anger. Another direction I'd like to take this is I was watching David Cho on YouTube, and I love watching him talk and paint while I paint. He's just such a fun, interesting, and very deeply spiritual dude to listen to and watch. And he brought up the topic of, he pronounced it as anger for a joke, obviously, but I just love that. So he's like, what do you need to be an artist, essentially? You need anger. And I'm like, yeah, that's right. And like how he's speaking to such a beautiful point of how you can alchemize your anger and how you can witness your anger through painting and using it as a fuel to create something beautiful and to, like sit with those emotions a bit differently. This is how art therapy works, quite obviously. It's just allowing yourself to sit in the experience, but not just like doing it in the rawest form, which can be very overwhelming for some people, but allowing yourself to express that through color or express that through images, or just like the flow of the artistic process can, in a way, be such a healthy channel for these emotions, which on their own might be too overwhelming. So, and just, he speaks more to letting go as well. Like he speaks to anger being the thing that he feels fuels his art and has allowed him to produce so much art. I don't know if you've heard of David Cho, but he's a pretty successful artist. But then he also speaks to how, hey guys and gals, all folks, all humans, all people, it's time to let go. What we can do in this piece, in the one video, he's really just talking about letting go of the anger, letting go of the experience of what anger was for you, like I was speaking to earlier. So now that you've felt your anger and you've imbued it into your art, now you can just live a more, what he calls, authentic life. And I would say just being less bitter, maybe feeling like things aren't shame-based, I suppose. Like things aren't being in a way more competitive from a place of proving your self-worth. Like that's how he was describing it. He was kind of like saying that before, the person who he was speaking to, they kind of were like, well, I used that anger. Yeah, I'm better than them. I'm making more art because fuck them, kind of thing. And yeah, that he was speaking to how that works for the most part, for the time being that may work, but then over time, you might not need to do that anymore. And if you can let go of that anger and not feel the need to prove your self-worth to others, how he sees you can be a lot more authentic and a lot more open and a lot more loving, and you can witness yourself and experience anger very differently. So I would say that anger has a beautiful role, or I guess art has the role in anger as well, in transmuting. And how if we're able to create containers to really feel anger in a healthy and embodied way, wow, what that can do for our bodies, what that can do for our emotional health, what that can do for our relationships, where we're not creating this kind of degree of tension or bitterness or passive aggressiveness from holding on to the anger and not feeling like we can fully express it. And I think a good example of this is humor, right? Humor, comedy in general, I would say it's a very healing tool. And it's very important that we're able to look at life in a playful, humorous way. And, I love to even introduce humor into my therapy sessions, to be honest, and into a lot of coaching as well. But if there's a way to which we're not expressing our anger and it starts to become imbued into our personality, maybe there's a degree to which we're passively aggressively creating humor as a channel or outlet for feeling our anger. And if we're doing that towards someone that we care about, just the impact that could have on them over the long term. It's like, if we're making all these kind of jokes that are in a way what we consider playful, but actually could be aggressive and could actually be creating a degree of hurt, of feeling hurt or feelings of resentment or whatever. It's like what that can do to a person, and the emotional experience of a person who's on the receiving end of a continuous flow of passive aggressive humor. So, I mean, some playfulness and some humor is okay. I think it's like there's a line there, but I also do want to bring awareness to where in a relationship that can become a form of bullying, which I would say is borderline, not always, but borderline emotional abuse or verbal abuse. So just being aware of how anger can manifest as humor at times. So the last way I want to examine this topic of anger, and I feel like this is potentially the most researched. I would say my personal experience is valuable, but at the same time, Brene Brown, she's a researcher on emotions, and she really has a beautiful perspective when it comes to all these different emotions, what they look like, what they feel like, her experience of researching them, and also, of course, being a social worker for pretty much all her life, or, after she got her accreditation, she's been doing social work for a long time. And I'm reading from Atlas of the Heart by Brene Brown. So this is the topic of anger as quoted by Brene Brown. If you looked across the research, you learn that anger is an emotion that we feel when something gets in the way of a desired outcome, or when we believe there's a violation of the way things should be. When we feel anger, we believe that someone or something else is to blame for an unfair or unjust situation, and that something can be done to resolve the problem. And I really appreciate the way that she ends that, is that something can be done to resolve the problem, or the anger, or the feeling or thought that something is unjust. There's an ability to resolve that. This is imbued into her definition of anger. So it goes on to say, anger is an action emotion. We want to do something when we feel it, and when we're on the receiving end of it. So we want to do something when we're on the receiving end of it as well. Additionally, according to Charles Spielberger, I believe how I pronounced that right, an influential anger researcher, angry feelings can vary in intensity from mild irritation or annoyance to fury and rage. And I think that's such an important thing to note, is that how much are we experiencing mild anger, which we could just kind of brush off, which we oftentimes might just have to brush off. Or then there's other experiences of more intense anger, and what that looks like for us. And if we're experiencing or receiving that, how we're so capable of setting boundaries around intense anger versus mild irritation, frustration, kind of a little bit of bitterness. Maybe we just kind of are much more likely to brush that off. So she goes on to say that anger is also a full contact emotion because it activates our nervous system and can hijack our thoughts and behaviors. It can take a real toll on our mental and physical health. Yeah, that's so interesting. And that's something I was trying to speak to earlier, is I would say, and this is something I've researched, but I'm not directly quoting aside from Brene Brown here, but there is a long-term component to anger. And I would say it's typically manifests in a form of chronic pain, or it can manifest in a variety of different mental illnesses, but I would say also in chronic pain. And it's kind of like when the long-term experience of anger gets internalized and normalized, and there's no capacity to really fully feel and release the anger, I would say where it can manifest would often be the body, and the way the body isn't really prepared to continuously, I would say, create conditions for that experience of anger. It would gradually deteriorate, or it would gradually have to, adapt or mutate in a way to compensate for this continual experience of anger, versus where, anger is meant to be a short-term, intentional, action-based response. And it's meant to be something that we move through and we're able to capably let go of, right? We're supposed to be able to feel it in the mind, feel it in the body, and there's a capacity to which we're able to take an action, change an environment, and then get a certain outcome that can, in a sense, allow us to feel like we can no longer feel angry. But I mean, how often are we able to really capably do that in our lives, in our society? Not trying to generalize too much that we're all incapable of removing anger from our lives, but I feel like we probably live in a climate nowadays where it is very challenging to fully escape the experience of anger. And there is a degree to which we can't just like rely on having a very, very peaceful environment at all times, and that we can't fully, just like retreat from the experience of anger. At least most of us can't afford to. And that makes sense. So just to quote Brene Brown again, according to 91% of emotions experts, she's wrong. But by saying that she spent a lot of her career saying that anger is a secondary, or it's an indicator emotion that often conceals emotions that are harder to recognize or own. And according to her book, she's saying there that most people say that. She's actually quite wrong about that. So she, according to the experts, anger is a primary emotion. It's not an indicator emotion. It's not something that's pointing towards another feeling. And I'm curious of that. She goes on to say there's a lot of debates about that. And let's see what her conclusion is. Well, I think she's speaking to how challenging it is for us to actually distinguish between anger and other emotions. And how, like, when we have a very limited emotional vocabulary, maybe we do attribute things to anger more than we ought to. And I feel that's a very interesting way to which just like simply sitting with our own emotions and sort of like checking in with ourselves and our body around like what is actually irritating us, what is anger, what is maybe something that's a little bit more nuanced, what is the intensity of this anger? Is this more of a sadness? Is this grief that's on some level masking itself as anger? But I mean, that's what she was proposing is how anger operates. But then she said that the data actually speaks to it being more of a primary emotion. She's got a lot of stuff here. She's got an entire image here, which basically is like a wheel of all these different emotions that she sees anger, what might be behind the anger. And I love this. And looks like one of the really big ones is fear, as I was speaking to earlier. What's behind that anger? What's in a sense motivating or fueling that anger? It could be anxiety. It could be hurt. It could be grief. It could be feeling isolated. It could be feeling, low or depressed. It could be overwhelming stress. It could be outrage at injustice. It could be jealousy. It could be shame. And the more I look at these, the more I recognize that some of these, such as isolation, it's kind of like there's a need underlying, right? There's a need for human connection. And when we're not having that need met, how that would create this emotional experience of isolation, and then how the isolation would in turn trigger an experience of anger. And so I just feel that's so beautiful, how anger can be this thing that I guess I more so agree with Brene Brown versus her sort of like counter argument in a way, but it's kind of like how it is this thing that indicates and points towards a need that's not being met. And maybe oftentimes you have to either take action or set a boundary to meet that need fully. And when we're sitting in the experience of anger fully, it's almost like, I would say, the part of us can communicate what the anger is trying to tell us, but we have to be open to sitting with that part. We have to give that part the respect and, really allow it to have a voice, like to have a dialogue with it. And give it the space, give it the permission, not fight the anger, not bypass it in some shape or form, kind of demonizing it as something that's too overwhelming for our body or for us to handle. And just like having gratitude for anger, being like, damn, this anger is really got some potent wisdom here. It's a teacher, it's a master. It's something that, if alchemized fully, can teach us some of the most potent lessons of our entire life. And so I just really want to honor my experience of anger. And I think a really good example for me, just to speak to what happened to me just the other day, was I was feeling very unreceptive to something my partner wanted to suggest to me. And I was like, why am I feeling so angry right now? And not like full on like aggression anger, but just feeling unreceptive, feeling closed off, right? What's this emotion where I'm setting these kind of these boundaries and these kind of guards. My guard is up. I just noticed that in my body. I noticed that in my emotional experience and how I was responding to my partner. It turns out I'd been releasing a shitload of anger in a very healthy way. I've been doing a lot of breath work, a lot of alchemizing, a lot of like self touch, like, touching and, releasing through my chest, releasing through other parts of my body. I did a lot of qigong, actually. I don't do that all the time. So I did a lot of different stuff. And turns out there was a lot of anger being felt through that emotional experience. I did a lot of toning using my voice. So anyway, even though I wasn't feeling the anger at that moment, it felt like there was this after effect of just like, I need to stay alert, and the protector part felt like it was still online, maybe from earlier in how I engaged with my body. But was really beautiful was that I instantly felt like, okay, well, how can I sit with this experience? Do I really need to be on my guard? Do I really need to be so closed off in a way? And I essentially asked my protector part. I was like, hey, protector part, I really appreciate that you're creating these boundaries. I really appreciate that you're feeling like there is something that you want to kind of like safeguard me against. And you know what? You're doing a really good job. But at the same time, I just want to recognize, hey, this is my partner here. She's actually offering me something that's really supportive. And, she has really good intentions and often has really good advice. And I would like to be a little bit more open to that. I'm wondering how you'd feel about just like trusting me and trusting them, and just seeing that if moving forward, we can just be a bit more receptive in this kind of way. And firstly, I communicated to my partner exactly what I just experienced in terms of why I was feeling a little bit more closed off. Made a request that, hey, if we could like talk about this more tomorrow, I'd probably be more receptive. I've been doing so much somatic work today, so much deep work, and so much anger came up through that. And yeah, I just noticed the protector part, communicated that to my partner. And then after asking the part itself if it would loosen and offer me some space, it did. And I felt a deep, deep release in my chest. I felt warmth. The part felt acknowledged. The part really did understand that it didn't need to be on its guard. And just like that, it felt like it was just loosened, and I was able to move through that experience. And that was such a minor example. That wasn't a tremendous experience of anger, but I would say there's a connection there between how that part responds to the subtler experiences of anger and the really intense, really overwhelming, fear-driven experiences of anger, or shame-driven experiences of anger that I would have in other situations. So then I just decided to communicate that to my partner. I told her how the protector part responded, and that I did this, and I felt like this was something I was trying to be responsible for, but the protector part was kind of making it harder, and not like blaming the protector part, but just like communicating that this was something that was happening for me in my experience. And yeah, she really appreciated it, and I was really happy to have been received in that. Like, I feel this is such an important aspect of being received in your anger, is safety from yourself, safety from the people in your life, especially a partner, and recognizing that it's your responsibility to be self-responsible in your anger. It's your responsibility to explore your emotions. It's your responsibility to go to counseling and alchemize your anger and find healthy outlets for it. But at the same time, having a person whom also works with their own anger and is receptive and understands and isn't like creating further shame or further rejection or further fear around the experience of being received in anger, like, you being angry and them receiving you in that anger. I would say it goes so far in terms of healing those protector parts, in terms of healing all parts of you. So, having a person who's on your side, who has the capacity to create support for you And this isn't just about a romantic partner, whereas I would find that's the most important example in a way, but I would say this goes to your friends. This goes to the facilitators who work at events that you're attending, especially if it's releasing deeper emotions, or your therapist or your coach, people who can receive you in those emotions, people who have the capacity to sit with their own emotional experience and create safety for you and yours. So that's pretty much all I got. Just wanted to remind people that I'm starting to host workshops. One is going to be educational groups around parts work. Another is going to be, once I get the ball rolling, integration spaces for psychedelics. Additionally, I want to create spaces for men to speak and be witnessed and received. And in addition to that, I'm going to be doing art workshops in person, probably in Burnaby. And if anyone's interested, those will be by donation. I'm not going to turn anyone away for lack of funds. And lastly, if you could leave a 5-star review on this podcast, I would seriously appreciate it. I'm trying to get more people turned on to this podcast. I really poured my heart into this. I really feel like people will resonate and appreciate what I bring in, and that would help so much. So thank you so much. I appreciate you tuning in, and I hope you have a great rest of your day. Take care for now.